Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information, learning resources, tools, and much more.
I'm Sean McCarthy, Director of Action and Sustainability Community Interest Company. It's my pleasure to introduce part two of our podcast series with John Morrison, Chief Executive of the Institute of Human Rights and Business.
The future's electric, yes. A lot of people will be impacted by this change. But I do think the biggest challenge in just transition terms will be agriculture. And we've hardly started that conversation in this country. Just look to India and the number of farmers and number of people who've been killed in protests in Delhi over recent years. Look to the farmers that mobilised around Brussels before the parliamentary elections. There's been some protest in Wales, for example, with all the Wellingtons in Cardiff. But at the moment, it's another systemic problem is that we're used to cheap food, right? It's in our supermarkets. Now, cheap food is very important to people who are poor, right? And we have food banks in this country in a way that none of us could have seen. But is the answer to food banks and poverty cheap food in supermarkets, or is it the government stepping in and supporting people in a better way? Because at the moment, cheap food in supermarkets means very tight margins for farmers and very tight margins for suppliers in other parts of the world as well, and low wages for migrant workers or whoever works in the fields. You can't get enough British people to work in the fields, and wages is one of the reasons that's the case, right? So, and that's all fed by the fact that we are used to cheap food. So there are many questions in agriculture that need to be tackled at the same time as any transition and any decarbonisation in agriculture will be possible. People talk about regenerative agriculture and the protection of soils. So you can't just try and solve the carbon question in agriculture without thinking about the biosphere, biodiversity, and the fact that we only have 40, 50 harvests left. Most soils are getting depleted at such a rate that unless we move to sort of crop rotation, a 12-year cycle, I believe, is what's recommended in Britain and most British farms. Unless we move back to a 12-year crop rotation cycle, our soils will be dead about the time we get past 2050 anyway. So we could save the world from climate change and tip ourselves to many other types of. So all of these things have to be solved at once, and farmers find themselves, right in the middle of this. They're meant to be rewilding, they're meant to be doing all these other things at the same time. And I think it was yesterday that the Farmers Union actually said that the government's target of 2040 decarbonisation in agriculture will be missed in this country unless the government really steps up. So I do think agriculture, because it relates to our food, it relates to our health, we are all touched by it. We are the consumers of it. And the supply chains go deep into our own country, every part of this country and abroad, is actually going to be even a bigger challenge than the energy transition that we've been talking about for the past few years. Yeah.
And I guess there are kind of food or fuel arguments as well, aren't there, around, it appears at the moment that it's more profitable for some farmers to rent their field out to fill it with solar panels than it is to actually produce food, or indeed to produce biocrops for biofuels.
Yeah, and this is another pinch point. Land itself is a pinch point. There is, I was with a farmer a few months ago, and he held up a football, with the leather patches around the football. And he said, these two patches here on this football is the only part of the world, the globe's surface, that is suitable for agriculture. And, there's a huge football and there was just two patches.
Yeah.
That's where we have the soil. And by the way, the soil is probably only about 2 foot deep in most of those places. And that's how we feed ourselves on this planet.
Oh my God.
The rest is is desert, is mountains, is ocean. Maybe you can keep goats and sheep in some of them, or camels, some of the places, but you can't grow stuff easily. And of course, to create places, the Gulf states are trying to do this at the moment. But if you're going to use hydrocarbons to cool horticulture tunnels, you're tackling one problem, but you're making
not really solving the problem. Yeah.
So feeding ourselves, I think, is going to be a big challenge, and I think that is going to make it's not just about all the rubbish we eat and the bad health that we have as a result of that. But how much meat can we afford? What are the meat-based alternatives, etc.? What does an equitable diet mean in a way that, I love my food. I really do love my food. I love cooking. I love going out to eat. But at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, should we still be eating, for example, should we still be eating fish like mackerel that is now moving towards the endangered list because you can't fish farm mackerel. They're all wild and there's a real dip in the ocean, the Atlantic population of mackerel, as there was for cod. 10, 15, cod is better off now, but mackerel is now in decline. And should we be used to eating the food that we like if the planet can't easily provide what we need? Should we just be, eating less and stuff that's locally sourced, more in season? If we all did that, for example, around the world, that would lessen the pressure, definitely. So there's a lot of things that have to happen all at once. And I think a lot of just transition conversations have ignored consumers, and we've got to bring consumers in, as we saw with the global spike in energy prices after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where we're still paying huge fuel bills in this country, and people are still paying a lot more for food all over the world because of that. Unless we find ways of bringing people with us, poor people particularly are not going to want to transition at all because they feel they're the ones that are going to suffer the most, and they will. And it takes me back to the actual origin of the term just transition. It surprises a lot of people. It comes from the US trade union movement in the 1980s. The US was denuclearizing to some extent because of the deals between Reagan and Gorbachev. And there were people in the US nuclear industry who were worried about their jobs, right? And so the core concept in the just transition concept that was developed then was that the cost of re-employing the worker, reskilling the worker, giving the worker sufficient social security and protection for them and their family should not just be borne by the individual or the trade union or even just the employer, but the society as a whole. The US society should bear the costs of the energy transition. And then it was a transition out of nuclear. It wasn't even the transition we're talking about now, but that's the origin of the just transition concept. And I think for worker organizations, that's essentially still there as the central premise, that society as a whole should bear the cost of transition. And so although each transition is place-based and time-bound and is very local, the cost of it has to be borne by society as a whole. And again, I think that gets lost in discussions a lot. Yeah.
And that comes back to government ultimately, then, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
We talk about society. Yeah. And it's interesting. That's news to me, where the expression just transition came from. And I guess the last place on earth I would expect that to originate from is the United States.
Yeah.
Because it's, it's very much the whole American culture is very much about the individual and about, not having this sort of collectivism. It's really interesting.
May the first Labor Day is a US invention too, which surprises a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Everything's a bit counterintuitive.
It's a place of many surprises. John, do you have any good examples of where this, the sort of concepts that you talk about, are there examples around the world where this is being done well?
Yeah, I think I'm a big fan of this being pre-competitive, where everyone rolls up their sleeves and seeds a little bit of their power into a sort of common endeavour. So the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission has been running for a few years. We don't hear enough about it in other parts of the UK. But the whole aim there was to bring trade unions, business, communities from different parts of Scotland together to talk about common purpose. And I think, the reports it's issued have looked at housing, they've looked at agriculture, they've looked at energy and North Sea, of course. Why the hell weren't we doing this another, why hasn't this been, why the Tata Steel plants in Port Talbot in Wales? Why hasn't there been a similar discussion around that, for example? It's interesting that the other parts of the UK have not picked up on this yet. And it's interesting, some cities have now developed just transition charters. London has, Bristol has, So beginning to see it at the sort of built environment level. I think that's one model, right? But it doesn't really have teeth. So in Australia now, they're just setting up the Net Zero Economy Authority to take a sort of intergenerational approach to the transition requirements, particularly around energy again. Remember, this is a country, Australia, that has hugely been into coal mining and coal exports for a very long time, where power is balanced between states and the federal government. And to really push this through, you need to have that sort of central authority. And it's not called a Just Transition Authority, but when you look at the statutes of it, it's essentially that. It's all about making sure people aren't left behind and that everyone is carried forward together. And that has real power. That's been giving statutory teeth. We have the Climate Change Committee in the UK, right, which was ahead of the curve, and that has some statutory power, some legal powers, as you know, but it doesn't really have delivery power, right? It doesn't. It's not the same as an authority, and GB Energy is part of the solution, but I don't see the just transition element there. So I'm still waiting to see where the UK government is going to fit this question, because if they don't, the pushback against what's happening on planning and what will happen in agriculture is going to be enormous, right, for the government. And now is the time that they should be thinking about the license to operate questions, the legitimacy, the explanation, and the trust that people need to have that this thing will be done fairly as possible, that everyone will suffer some pain, but it won't be certain people in society that have to carry the whole burden, whether they be farmers, whether they be poor consumers, etc. It's quite easy. I just see us flipping into a reality in 3 or 4 years' time, where there are certain people thinking, "Oh, this climate transition thing is just for the urban elite. It's just the Guardian reading type, and it's me and my family that are carrying the pain on this." We can't. We fail at that point. Everything fails, and I want to see a government. I want to see our current government demonstrating enough foresight that it's going to cede some power now to some authority or some body that has that sort of longer term trust, that takes an intergenerational approach and takes it above the fray of daily politics, and is trusted enough to make some of these tougher decisions. Parliament MPs are too much. They have the interest of their constituencies front of mind, of course, and their constituents. So NIMBYism is always going to creep in when it comes to MPs. Businesses have their own interests. There's no other party at the moment that can really take that sort of objective, long-term approach. So that's what I think we need, Sean. And as I say, in Australia, Spain and Poland, and there have been a few places in Scotland where some of this has been demonstrated to some extent. But I think everyone's learning together at the moment, yeah.
Yeah, I think this expression together is interesting, isn't it? Because you're absolutely right. If we are going to crack this problem, it needs to be together. And certainly from my experience as well in Scotland, we've got a kind of an offshoot of our supply chain sustainability school that not very many people know about, but it's called the Scottish Business Climate Collaboration. And it came out of the COP in Glasgow. And there's a whole eclectic group of businesses in there. There's banks, there's oil and gas businesses, there's manufacturers and everything. And the only thing they have in common is that they have significant business interest in Scotland. And they've all come together to say, okay, we need an online learning environment so people can learn about climate change and carbon management, etc. And that's something that my business provides as a kind of a white label product, if you like. And that's really interesting that, okay, it may have taken the COP being hosted in Glasgow for people to wake up to this, but I thought it was very refreshing to see such an eclectic group of businesses coming together, that they're not in the same sector, they don't have the same interest or the same customers or the same investors, that it was just the Scottishness that brought them together. And I guess the world needs to see more examples like that.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, just transitions have to be place-based, right? So this is another worry I have, is a lot of the way that business thinks about transition at the moment is at the entity level.
Yeah.
So lots of businesses are writing their corporate transition plans. But it's hard to really be serious about just transition in that way, because it's an arbitrary, corporates are headquartered here, they have suppliers there. Yeah. They're not really place-based, right? I mean, they might have assets or manufacturing sites that are. But each of those requires its own transition plan. Each locality, each major employer that is really geographically understood, some of that will have a global supply chain coming into it, but you have defined affected stakeholders, so people know. And this is where SSE, the Scottish, Southern Scottish Electricity, Scottish and Southern, or I always get it wrong.
Scottish and Southern Energy.
I mean, we always talk about them because they do have a just transition plan, but they've been very good at really making it local, making it place-based. The 700 workers who've been re-employed in the green side of the company, etc. They're tangible. You can actually list the names of the people. It is meaningful. It is direct. That's the level in which the transition has to happen. For it to be just, to be felt to be just, because at the end of the day, the people that will decide if the transition has been just will not be you or me or any company with a certificate on the wall. It will be the people most affected, and they will decide in their heads and then in the ballot box and what they say as to whether they felt it was just and equitable. And that's why I think the SSE approach of place-based, time-bound transition is exactly what we need to do, in addition to the entity-based transition plans that can work at a more strategic level. And I just don't see enough people following SSE's model there at the moment. Yeah,
it's interesting as well as when you listen to SSE talking about this, they actually draw lessons from the demise of the British coal mining industry, and everything that was wrong about the way that was done, and learning from that. This whole place-based idea is really interesting. John, we've spoken about supply chains quite a lot. The expression has been mentioned several times. A lot of our audience are people that are in the procurement profession or in the areas of supply chain management generally. In terms of some of the things that you're talking about and thinking about, what would your advice be to them? If you're a chief procurement officer of a big corporation or something, what sort of things do they need to be thinking about today?
I think to think about it as holistically as possible. Now, the danger is particularly companies, British companies that find themselves in the supply chain of European companies, etc., who are going to be picked up by the several things that are coming out of Brussels now, whether it be CSDDD, CSRD, the timber regulation, the forced labour directive, etc. All of them touch our space, Sean, and I know you've had other podcasts on these things. It's easy then to sort of begin to slip into a sort of legal compliance mindset, right? As to, how much auditing do we need to do? How do we ensure we comply with X, Y, Z? And of course, that's the price of success to some extent in terms of when you make this stuff regulatory. But I think that's not really, if we just keep it in that place, we're not going to, companies are not really going to get the value out of the transition themselves, and we're not going to be successful in realizing the potential of it as societies. Think about the pinch points. Think about the company. Try to elevate to board level or executive committee level how sustainability issues will be material to the business as well as the business being material to sustainability. So the true meaning of double materiality. Most companies now will have some element of sustainability in their risk registers, right? At board level. Ensure that the pinch points we've been talking about, many of which will be in the supply chain, are properly understood in the forecasting for the company itself. That might be too much dependence on China or parts of China or some other source country. It might be pinch points around particular commodities that are likely to occur, or geopolitical stuff around shipping. And, there are many ways in which supply can be adversely affected, even at very short notice. Are those things fully understood? Are some of them in the risk register of the company? Are you planning? Are you mitigating? Are you, because they might not all be sustainability focused. Some of them might just seem to be purely commercial, but every pinch point has an impact on people. Haven't we seen that with the Ever Given? The ship that got lodged in the Suez Canal, and any disruption to, and what's been happening off Yemen, with the rerouting of shipping and the longer delivery times. Any disruption to trade and supply will have a social consequence. And so, in a sense, I would say any supply chain issue is a sustainability issue. Whether it's and that is for me the true meaning of double materiality is that everything is material to everything else, and make sure that your company understands that, and that your senior management are rewarding you and developing codes of conduct and management systems that are agile enough to adapt. Whether it be, we've had it with COVID, we've had it with the Ever Given, we've had it with Ukraine, all of these disruptions to supply, none of which perhaps were foreseen. But have we learned the lessons from these? Because there are going to be many more to come. We can be sure of that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, again, going back to the example of copper as a proxy for just about everything else. I mean, if you're buying products that have copper in that don't need copper, then find another material, because the inevitable consequence, the price of copper is just going to go up and up, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting watching the trading price on copper. I mean, I'm not a trader, but I mean, there was a lot of talk a few months ago that it was about to rocket, and then it seems to rocket, and then it plateaued, and so we've yet to see the market. I mean, because I don't know if you get commodity traders listening to your podcast, but we do work with quite a lot of them in Switzerland and elsewhere. So I don't want to be naive. The price of nickel dropped this year because Indonesia dumped a load onto the global market.
Yeah.
So there are these short-term fluctuations, right, in commodity pricing. But I think the long-term predictions around most of these commodities are pretty certain because of scarcity. And the geopolitics and then the securitization of supply is just making that more acute than was the case before. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know how companies figure that in financially, but I think there will be the is your financial director using the right forecasting around commodity prices? Yeah. And are those scenarios building in scarcity? And also the effects of climate change, right? So this is the other thing. We're now living, the feedback loop of climate change is already affecting us. So heat stress, natural disasters, crop failure, flooding, these things are already happening. Some of these things are already becoming uninsurable against, right? Are you factoring in resilience and adaptation to your supply, as well as the mitigations against the effects of climate change itself? And so, the loop is already closed in that way. So,
yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I've worked with some of my clients looking at water scarcity in products that require a lot of water for their manufacturing. And actually, where are these products coming from? And are there areas of the world that will have water in the future, or enough water?
Yeah, if it wasn't so scary, it would be wonderfully fascinating. But it is still wonderfully fascinating.
Yeah, it is, and it's still very scary. Okay, John, I guess I'm very conscious that you've only got the hour. So, is there anything else that you would like to cover that you feel that we haven't touched on?
No, it's been a great discussion, Sean, and I would love, when the book is out, for people to tell me what they think about it.
Yeah.
Some people turn off when you start talking about systems thinking, and because they think about all the swirly lines and diagrams and everything is interconnected. Therefore, there's no real accountability or responsibility in the system because everyone passes the buck around, and systems theory can easily sort of just make you feel a bit sleepy.
Yeah.
And I get that. So what I try to do is challenge us to think, embrace complexity, but then be very concrete about the steps you're going to take to maximize your leverage within the system. And I try to do that, and the book tries to be full of as many examples as I can find of that. But it's not an easy thing to do. And as I say, institutions, our job titles, the way we're paid and rewarded, the way we're educated, all of these things sort of mitigate against that sort of systems thinking. I hope to see, I think management schools teach it more these days than they used to, but I think we all need to be educating ourselves more on systems thinking. So if any of your listeners become interested, Kate Rayworth takes quite a lot of it in her own books on donut economics. So she tries to take it into the economics world. I'm trying to take it into the sustainability world in a way, or the social sustainability world, at least. I think a lot of it is there in climate science already. I would say, though, what I'm not talking about is hard systems theory. So I'm not pretending that human beings behave the same way as computer systems, for example. So it's not systems theory, it's systems thinking approach.
Yeah.
So it is some of the ideas around that and applying it to the way that humans behave and how we incentivize each other, which of course is a very different way than, we don't always behave in rational ways as human beings. So there's a huge behavioral science element. So any people working in that area, I'd love to know what you think about the book and how, if there are other examples of how this is, maybe not on climate, but other issues. People talk about, the change of culture around smoking or the change of culture around wearing seatbelts and things, other sort of big behavioral changes we've had. And, there's nudge theory and all these other things that people have developed. For climate action, I'd be interested to know which of these sort of behavioral things are going to be most successful. One thing I do know is that equity, some sense of equity in the sense that we're all in this together, is absolutely essential. Otherwise, people will just disengage from it. And that's my biggest worry at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So we look forward to the book. We'll pop a link to the book on our website once it's published. So please do let us know. So John, it's been a pleasure as always. And thanks very much for sharing your thoughts with us. I think, as you say, it's fascinating, but it's also quite scary. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners will be going, "Oh my God, what do I need to do now?"
There's a few jokes in the book.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah,
Mary Robinson wrote the foreword. The former president of Ireland. She kindly wrote the foreword for me, and she said I use a lot of wit in the book.
Good.
So, it's less humour, but there's a bit of wit in there, and to try and make it, readable.
We all need wit in these very scary times. So, John, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Sean. Take care. Bye.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on sense and sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more content on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.